Welcome to the section, Chart Annotation. In the previous section, we learned how to use scales to translate our data from domain into ranges for our display. We will now learn to use those scales to create axes, and to create titles for each of the axes, and also to create a legend on our chart to describe the colors that will be used in our bubbles. In this section, we will look at 7 different topics relative to creating chart annotations. In the first video, Drawing Axes, we will look at the fundamentals of creating axes objects. We'll cover how to create the axes from our existing scales. We'll then examine how to create left, top, right, and bottom axes. We'll learn how to position the axes using transformations. And we'll briefly examine the SVG that is created to render the axes. In the second video, Positioning for Axes, we'll learn how to position the axes around our visualization. During this, we'll learn about the concept of margins and how to include margins along with the axes and position the data relative to each other. In the third video, Styling Axes, we will cover how to change the thickness and color of both the lines and the ticks in the axes. In the fourth video, Axes Titles, we'll learn to add titles to our axes. During this lesson, we'll learn how to position, rotate, and orient the text relative to the axes. In the fifth video, Custom Tick Labels, we'll learn how to change the default labels that are placed along the axes with our own text. This will involve describing how to create the text for each of the ticks, as well as how to control the positioning of the text at a very detailed level. In the sixth video, we'll learn how to create a legend for our visualization. The legend will be used to convey to the viewer of your visualization what the meaning of the colors are that were within our bubbles. In the seventh and final video, we'll look at how to add horizontal and vertical grid lines to our visualization. Welcome to the first video of this section, Drawing Axes. During this video, we're going to cover a number of topics. We'll start with the basics of creating an axis from a scale. We'll look at the SVG that was created by D3 for the scale, and we'll learn how to create axes that can be placed on both the left, right, top, and the bottom of our visualization. We will examine how to render the axis into an SVG group and how to transform that group to position the axis in the appropriate location. And we will also look at how we can control the number of ticks that are rendered along an axis. Alright, well, I've jumped into the editor and I have opened our index.html file from the 1.4.1 begin folder. So let's close the Explorer here to have a little more room. So this code is the same from the last example where we just left off. So let's go and add in some code here to create some axes. We're going to go down and we're going to put this in right before we create our circles. Now an axis is generated off of our scales. For an x-axis we'll use our x scale, and for a y-axis we'll use our y scale variable. So let's start this by creating a variable y-axis, and we'll set that to be equal to d3.axis left, which creates an axis suitable for the left side of our visual. Now the axis needs to be assigned a scale, so we'll call the .scale function and we'll pass in our y-scale variable. Now this code doesn't actually render the axis, it just creates a function that can be used to generate the SVG for an axis. To actually render the axis, we need to tell an SVG element, in this case SVG, and we tell it to call the axis object. So what this does is it basically allows our axis function to render into the SVG element. So let's go and take a look at the result of this in the browser. What we see here is that there's a vertical black line on the left side of our visualization. That's actually the axis. And since it's a left axis, the tick marks and labels are actually to the left of that line. So they're not visible in this presentation. Therefore, we'll need to go and translate this axis a little bit to the right so that we can see that information. So let's get back into code here and see how we can do that transformation. The way I like to do this is to create an grouping SVG element. We'll eventually render our axis into this group, but by wrapping the axis with this group, it's easy for us to just transform the group into position. So we're going to translate this group over by 30 pixels on the X and no pixels along the Y. Then instead of having SVG call the axis, we'll just chain this onto our group so that the axis then renders into that group. So let's head on over to the browser, and now we can see the entire axis. The axis consists of 3 primary components. These are the line that draws the primary portion of the axis, the lines which constitute the ticks, and the labels which are placed upon those ticks. We'll come back in a little bit and actually examine the SVG that represents this axis. Now this axis represents our fertility rate data. And if you notice, 0's at the top and it increases going down. We'd like to have 0 at the bottom and have the values increasing as they go up. Fortunately, this is a really easy fix to make, and all it requires is swapping the values on the domain for our Y scale. So instead of 0 to the max of the fertility rates, we'll do the max of the fertility rates to 0. Now let's head back into the browser. You can see the labels on our axis are now inverted, and also the data inverted, which is very interesting because we changed the axis, which had an effect on both the positioning of the bubbles and the axis that's based on it. Now let's look at creating an axis that will go on the right side of our chart. To do this, we just changed the axis left function call to axis right. Now going back into the browser, we can see that flipped the ticks and labels over to the right side of the axis line. So this axis would be suitable for placing on the right side of our visualization. Now let's go look at creating an x-axis. So to do that, we'll just copy this code for the y-axis. There we go. So let's rename this to x-axis, and instead of axis right, let's do axis bottom. And instead of y scale, let's use our x scale. Now we'll want to translate this to be at the bottom, so let's get rid of this and do 0 for that. And then let's use the height of the SVG minus 30, and close that statement. And then let's change the call the y-axis to x-axis. So let's go see what this has done. And there we go. We have an x-axis down at the bottom, and it's auto-numbered to be representative of our life expectancy values. Now you may notice here that our axes are overlapping. That's because we have to position axes ourselves. D3.js doesn't do this automatically for us. And at this point, we've kind of just positioned these arbitrarily. We'll look at how to do proper positioning in the next video. So let's go back into the code, and let's look at how we could make this an axis that would be for the top. We just change axis bottom to axis top, and like with axis left to axis right, this is going to flip those ticks and labels around to the other side of that axis. Now right now, both of our axes are the wrong direction, so let's head back into the code and change our axis right to axis left, and then axis top back to axis bottom. So let's head back into the browser, and our axes are now in the right orientation. Now let's go and look at the SVG that has been created for these axes. So let's go and inspect this axis. So let's right click on that and open inspect. It's a little tough to click exactly on that. This opened up on the main SVG element. So let's go expand into that SVG element. There you can see we have two groups, one for our left and one for our bottom axis, and you can see them being highlighted. Expanding open that one axis, we can see here that it consists of a path, which draws the actual line of the axis. Now note that the path has a class of domain. This is important because we'll be able to use this to style this line. And then each tick is represented by its own group. That group representing the tick is translated into position based upon how the axis is calculated. And we can see every single tick has its own group, which represents the actual line and the text label. Also note here that each tick group has a class named tick, and we could be able to use this later to style that tick also. Now, while we have to explicitly position our axes ourselves, D3 does do some magic here to determine how many ticks should be on the axis. There are algorithms to determine the default number of ticks and to determine where to position them so they fall on round numbers. But if you don't like the number of ticks or the numbers there, we can go and use some constructs to change the number of ticks. So let's go into our code and look at how to do that. We can control the number of ticks by chaining on a call on our axis to the ticks function and specify the number of ticks that we'd like to have along that axis. So let's change this to 20. So let's go look at this in the browser, and you can see now we have 20 ticks, and now we see the values increasing by 5. As there are 20 ticks spread from a range of 0 to roughly 100. So let's hop back over into the code and let's remove this, and we're done with this video. In this video, we've learned how to create axes, but we just kind of position them arbitrarily on our visualization.